Fox News Alert right now. We start at the White House. President Biden is expected to formally take questions today in a news conference for the first time since Hamas's brutal attack on Israel nearly 3 weeks ago.
So it comes as the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, confirms at least 33 Americans were killed by the terrorist group. 10 Americans are still missing, Ainsley.
Here at home, families of American hostages still being held captive in Gaza are lobbying on Capitol Hill today, demanding that lawmakers do more to bring their loved ones home.
And we just spoke to some of them. And speaking of Capitol Hill, I am in Washington this morning as the sun comes up. The big news, Louisiana Congressman Mike Johnson has emerged as the new frontrunner in the race for House Speaker. We could see a vote starting at noon today in that building behind us. Meanwhile, we have live team coverage. Mark Meredith is down the street from me. He's at the White House. But first, Trey Yingst is on the ground in southern Israel with the very latest. Trey?
Hey guys, good morning. The Israelis continue their strikes against the Gaza Strip. I do want to tell you a little bit about last night as we were along the border watching these flashes of light, both tank fire and airstrikes into Hamas and Islamic Jihad positions. We could see Israeli authorities and soldiers near the border. There was some level of commotion, small arms back and forth, and flares being fired into the air. We've learned today that 2 Hamas militants tried to infiltrate through the Zakim beach area into southern Israel. So it gives you a sense 19 days into this conflict, this is still both a ground and air conflict. Just last hour, Hamas fired a long-range rocket north of the city of Haifa. This sits in the northern part of Israel, so they're still able to maintain their ability to fire rockets toward major population centers despite the thousands of airstrikes that are taking place along the Gaza Strip and the continued attempts for infiltration. I do want to draw your attention to the north, though. Along the border with Lebanon, more anti-tank guided missile attacks into Israeli territory. The Israelis striking more Hezbollah positions, both command centers and launch points, trying to hit as many of those cells as possible. And then overnight in the West Bank, the Israelis say that they struck a group of militants in the refugee camp of Jenin, killing 3 of them that were throwing explosive devices at Israeli soldiers. So we really are looking at a 3-front situation here. The Israelis bracing for what could come next, and the entire country uncertain about when that ground invasion into the Strip will be decided. Guys, back to you.
Hey, Trey, is there a sense that the Prime Minister Netanyahu has to get the go-ahead from President Biden to do anything? Because I hear his right is very frustrated. They can't figure out why they're waiting. Can you get a sense of the politics there?
Absolutely. We could talk about the politics of the Americans and also the other regional players in all of this. According to reports, the United States is urging the Israelis to not immediately enter Gaza and move forward with this ground operation, despite the staging here in southern Israel of thousands of infantry troops, tanks, and APCs that are ready to take the battle to Hamas. This is for 2 reasons. One has to do with the hostages that haven't yet been freed, 220 people being held by Hamas inside Gaza. The other has to do with the plan for the future and who will take care of Gaza once Hamas is destroyed. And that's a real concern because you have more than 2 million civilians, and the death toll in Gaza is rapidly rising. More than 5,700 people have been killed, according to local authorities. I do want to read you, though, just a statement we received this morning by Israel's national security advisor that gives us some insight on what's taking place. He says, "I'm pleased to say that Qatar is becoming an essential party and stakeholder in the facilitation of humanitarian solutions. Qatar's diplomatic efforts are crucial at this time." So clearly the Qataris are working behind the scenes, trying to ferry messages between the Israelis and Hamas and get as many of those civilians that are being held inside Gaza to safety.
Trey, the people you talk to that serve the country and the IDF, what are they saying? Do they want to go in?
They do. The vast majority of soldiers that I've been texting with and staying in touch with along the border say they're ready to take the battle to Hamas. They saw the massacre that took place on October 7th. They understand the trauma that Israel has faced on what's being called the country's darkest day. And so they're ready to not just degrade the capabilities of this organization in the Strip, but completely eradicate Hamas from the map. They want to get rid of the group that caused the pain and the suffering of their people. And so they're ready. They're ready to go, and they're waiting for those orders. And that's part of the calculation the Israeli political echelon has to make in all of this. understanding that each and every day that goes by, you have soldiers that have this adrenaline here in the South. They're ready to go. And some of that will die down as the days pass.
You know, Trey, I'm just curious. Obviously, these folks are still healing. They're preparing for war. But there's protests happening all across the country, all across the world, in fact, of people that don't support them. And I'm just curious, do they feel the support there on the ground, or do they see what's happening all across the world where there's a lot of folks that are supporting Hamas?
They absolutely see the support. We were just at a hospital, and we'll bring you that story later, about newborns amid the war who are being delivered in a reinforced maternity ward. We actually held a 1-hour-old baby, just a bright moment amid this really dark story. But they see the support, and one man actually said, tell the people in New Jersey, his family was from New Jersey, we see the support, and thank you for sending all this love and actual goods to the soldiers on the front lines. But they also see the protests that are taking place across the world. And remember, this is probably the most complex story on earth to cover, because people see the images from inside Gaza. Save the Children says more than 2,000 people under 18 have been killed since this war erupted inside the Strip. And many of those are innocent civilians that are caught amid the crossfire. So it's an incredibly emotional and complex story to cover. And the Israelis understand that. They've been dealing with this for years. The communities here along the border have lived under rocket fire. They've raised their children in bomb shelters in many cases. And so they understand what's taking place, not just here on the ground, but the reaction from around the world.
That's sad.
That's right.
Steve?
Indeed. Trey, thank you very much for the live report from southern portions of Israel. All right. Meanwhile, also in the Mideast, Iranian-backed militias are mounting new attacks against U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria.
Wow. Mark Meredith is live at the White House with more. Is there a response yet, Mark, from the White House?
Lawrence, there is. Good morning to all of you. And Steve, welcome back here to Washington. U.S. officials say they are closely watching these developments, these recent attacks, both rocket and drone attacks on U.S. forces serving in the Middle East, calling them not only troubling, but of growing concern. And while these attacks are being carried out by third-party groups, they believe the Iranians have their fingerprints all over them. We've been learning about these attacks in more details, including just last night as the Pentagon released new details with at least 24 service members injured over the last few days in these attacks taking place both in Iraq and in Syria. While new U.S. troops have been killed, at least one American contractor died after suffering a cardiac incident, basically panicked after these drone attacks were being launched at the base they were at. Now the U.S. is warning Iran directly and the militias involved to tread carefully.
The United States does not seek conflict with Iran. We do not want this war to widen. But if Iran or its proxies attack U.S. personnel anywhere, make no mistake, we will defend our people, we will defend our security swiftly and decisively.
Today, we expect President Biden to offer his latest reaction to the developments in the Middle East. He's welcoming the Prime Minister of Australia here to the White House. There will be a news conference in the noon hour. On Tuesday, the president spoke with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince to talk about efforts to keep this conflict from growing any larger, from widening any more than it already has. Back here in Washington, more drama overnight up on Capitol Hill. House Republicans have selected another speaker designate, but it's unclear if he's going to have the votes to win the gavel officially. Mike Johnson of Louisiana won the most votes overnight after multiple rounds of balloting. He is 51 years old. He served in the House since 2017. He's the former chair of the Republican Study Committee. And while I said there's no guarantee that he's going to get the gavel, he does appear to be a little bit closer than some of those candidates who've come before him. We'll look to see what happens on the House floor a little bit later on today. Meantime, this photo just coming into our newsroom, coming from the governor of California as he shakes hands with the president of China, President Xi Jinping. This was a meeting that took place today in Beijing. Governor Newsom is on a week-long tour of China. He was in Hong Kong on Monday. And it's interesting, in this conversation with President Xi, we're told that the governor talked about climate change, efforts to develop more economic relationship between California and China. But some Republicans have slammed Newsom's visit as delusional, given the ongoing state of affairs between the U.S. and China. Steve, Ainsley, Brian, and Lawrence, back to you guys.
Right, and how bad California's doing. He feels like he wants to talk solar panels with the Chinese president. Thanks,
very
Mark.
Presidential, right?
Right. Well, he looks good. He's a handsome man. But in terms of the reverse side of his baseball card is the issue. I would just bring up one thing. It is so maddening that we are not hitting back at the Iranian-sponsored militias that are lining up our guys. They're not telling us when these attacks take place. We find out about it days later. We have all those weapons and assets in the area, and we're not allowing it. Knocking a drone out of the sky that's about to kill you is not being on the front foot.
I'm sorry. It's so crazy because I remember back in 2018, you got in Syria, you got the Wagner group that are striking a JSOC post. Mattis gets on the phone, calls his counterpart. He says, "Are you guys striking us?" And of course, his Russian counterpart says, "No, we're not doing that." Okay. Mattis gets back on. He calls Dunford. He goes, "You know what? Annihilate them." And they took out 250 to 300 forces in the Wagner group. That is a response to something. It seems like, Ainsley, the position of the White House is just posture.
We don't want to fight. We don't want to fight.
Yeah.
They're attacking us, and we're saying we don't want to fight. We give you $900 billion to defend America and the free world, and you sit there in a crouch, in the fetal position.
Well, yesterday, Jackie Heinrich was talking with John Kirby, and she said, you've said in the past Iran wasn't involved in all of this in Israel. He said, that's not what I was saying. He said, Iran is certainly complicit. He said, without them, there is no Hamas. Without them, there is no Hezbollah. 20 of our men were injured in Syria. 4 were injured last week in Iraq. This is the first we're hearing about this. These attacks were U.S. military bases. We saw the map of that in the Middle East, and they were conducted by rockets, and they were conducted by drones, Steve.
They're not in fear of America.
No, they're not.
They are not. And one of the other things that Kirby said was that any sort of a ceasefire only helps Hamas at this point. I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.